Hello, fiber friends. Welcome back to the Made It Better One and Its YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be talking about test knitting. So, love it or hate it, you probably have some opinions about it. So, I hope you'll join me for a little chat about whether test knitting is exploitation or collaboration. All right, friends, welcome to this week's video. We are going to be touching on a controversial topic, sort of, which is test knitting. I say controversial because it can bring up some strong feelings that people have one way or the other. Basically, I'm just going to be sharing my thoughts as someone who has been both a designer and a test knitter about the whole process, about accusations that it is exploitative, about concerns that people have, about ultimately how I personally view test knitting. And I would love to hear your comments, so definitely be sure to leave those. So test knitting, in case you're somehow unaware, is basically designer has a pattern, gives it to some knitters ahead of its publication to test it out. That's sort of the very basics of it. So the end result is that hopefully the designer produces a better pattern. They have a better idea of how much yarn is required for each size. They are able to share pictures of that pattern on different body types, different body sizes, and using different yarns. Test knitters are not paid. So this is where we get into concerns about test knitting being exploitative. Test knitters are, by and large, not paid in cash for the work that they are doing. In addition to the fact that test knitters are not paid, the relationship is sometimes viewed as one-sided. There's a lot of benefits for the designer and very few for the test knitter. You will also find people who have had, some knitters who have had negative experiences with the test knitting process because designers have unreasonable expectations or onerous requirements for the test knit that have overall made the test knitting process unpleasant and made it feel exploitative. However, test knitting remains very popular. People really seem to enjoy test knitting. Some podcasters here on YouTube, Young Folk Knits, for example, she does lots of test knitting for Sari Nordland and Andrea Mallory. Most of the most popular designers don't have any difficulty finding test knitters. So clearly not everybody views this as an exploitative relationship. So as I said, I have been on both sides. I design patterns. I have also done test knits. And I think there's a bit of truth to both sides of this argument. Test knitting can be exploitative, but I also think there's an opportunity for it to be more of a collaborative relationship. And that is something that requires, kind of buy-in from both sides. Both the designer and the test knitter need to view it from that perspective. So I start out by saying that on the face of it, yes, test knitters are not paid. They are providing free labor. There's really no getting around that. However, test knitting the way it is now is really a very new thing. A lot of designers now are having, specifically talking about garments, having them tested in every size in the pattern, sometimes by multiple people for every size. So if your pattern has 10 sizes, you might have 30 people in your test knitting pool all testing this pattern. There are, maybe 5 designers who are making enough money from knitting pattern design that they could maybe pay in cash test knitters. So if you missed my discussion about designers making money from knitting patterns, you can check that out over here. But the vast majority of designers are not making anywhere near enough money to pay test knitters. Okay, well, if you can't pay people, maybe you shouldn't have those people. And for most businesses, most business models, that is true. But test knitting is entirely voluntary. Nobody is being forced to test knit. Nobody is having to say, if I don't do this test knit, I won't be able to feed my children. Like, it's not that kind of a situation where, okay, sweatshops are exploitative because they have a captive pool of laborers who need some kind of money and would rather take little than nothing. This is not that kind of a situation. Nobody is being required to test knit. It's completely voluntary. And then the last point I wanted to make, sort of countering the idea that this is inherently an exploitative relationship, is that it's not actually the designers who want all of these test knits. Because if a designer hires a good tech editor, and tech editors, maybe charge $40 an hour and take 3 hours-ish to tech edit a pattern. So that's, $120 to one person, which is a completely reasonable expense. A good tech editor can make sure that your pattern is, I'm not going to say completely error-free because mistakes always slip through, but to make sure your pattern is in good shape, is overwhelmingly correct, and is graded correctly, meaning that you, the designer, have made adjustments to your grading formula for differences in proportion between sizes, particularly for larger sizes. A good tech editor is going to do all that. You don't need test knitters for that. Test knitters are really about, as I said, showing the pattern on different shapes and sizes and in different yarns. And who benefits from that is really other knitters. So test knitting in that regard is not necessarily a service being provided to the designer, though having those photos may encourage more sales. It's really a service to other knitters who want the reassurance that this pattern is going to work for them, for their body size, that this pattern maybe is going to still look good if they choose a different yarn. So it's as much a service for fellow knitters as it is for the designer in some sense. That is not to say, though, that the relationship can't be exploitative. Certainly there are designers who have not done well by their test knitters. They have imposed unrealistic deadlines. They require you to use the same yarn that is used in the sample, which means you can't work from your stash. You've got to go out and buy that specific yarn. They want a whole bunch of, photos and feedback and social media posts, and they're requiring a lot in that regard. I have even heard cases where designers, and I get this from a certain point because I have had many people flake out on test knits, take the pattern, disappear. But I have seen stories where designers have at least floated the idea of charging you for the pattern if you don't finish the test.
Not cool.
How they would do that, I don't know. So yes, there is always going to be, knitting is like any other industry. There are going to be bad guys. There are going to be people who are abusing your goodwill in offering to test. That's very unfortunate, but it is not really unexpected. But ultimately, I think with sort of the engagement of both sides in making the experience a good one, test knitting can be more collaboration than exploitation. So for example, we all have times where we can't afford to buy yarn. We can't afford to buy patterns. We're on a budget. We would still like to support our favorite makers, our favorite creators. Test knitting is a good way to do that. It is a way that you can support a designer that you like, even when you can't afford to buy their patterns. So when you look at it from that perspective, you are, volunteering your services to their cause. Yes, their cause is ultimately a business, but as mentioned in the video, um, hardly anybody's actually making any good money from said business. So additional support in providing a test knitting service is always, I'm sure, welcome, and is giving you a way, to give back. Secondly, I think, again, while there is not, generally speaking, monetary compensation for test knitting, there are some benefits, and designers can work to make sure that these kind of benefits are available to their test knitters. So first, you get the pattern you're testing for free, obviously. Most designers are going to give you another free pattern when you complete your test. What complete means is up to each individual designer. We'll talk about that a little bit, but essentially, you're going to get two probably free patterns for your test knitting efforts. A lot of a lot of pattern designers are able to arrange discounts on yarn to go along with their test. Now, if you're required to buy the yarn, that's not really any kind of benefit or compensation for you. But if you like the yarn, you want to use the yarn, and you can get it at a discount, great. If you are trying to test something that you simply don't have the yarn for in stash, and you can get that specific yarn at a lower price, hey, that's a nice perk. And then there's also exposure. Now, we all know that exposure does not pay the bills. However, it may have some value to you personally. If you are trying to grow your social media, or you're trying to grow your YouTube channel, and you are able to share this designer's work, the designer most likely has more followers and more of an audience than you do, and they are then resharing your work, then that might bring more followers to your Instagram account. It might bring more subscribers to your YouTube, which eventually you can monetize. So while exposure is not, generally speaking, fair compensation for labor, it is something in this instance, in a situation where you are providing some kind of support to the designer, and they are in turn providing support in the form of this exposure back to you. Now, if that is not something that you value, obviously that does not going to factor in to your decision. But if it is, again, another perk. But probably the biggest perk, and you will see this with a lot of the bigger designers, but I would encourage you to look at some of the smaller designers as well, is the sense of community that you may find among all of the test knitters for that designer. Some might call this cliquey. Whether there's any truth to that or not, I don't know. I have not test knit for any of the big designers. And not all of the designers have this. Some, people do run their tests different ways. But some designers do run their tests on platforms like Discord or Slack, where you're going to get to chat with other knitters and share. And, especially in, I think, during the pandemic, when we were all very isolated, but even now, times are tough. It can be hard to find your local knitting community depending on where you are. If you've got kids, you're not in a position to go out to knit nights and things like that. It is providing perhaps a sense of community to interact with other testers, whether that's on a single pattern, or if you become sort of a regular tester for a designer, and you get to know other people who are also regular testers. And if that's not something that you value, that's not going to factor into your decision. But if it is a nice benefit. It's sort of a silly thing, but we all, sometimes like being on the inside. I'm in a secret club! Getting into things early and feeling like we're special. We're the first person that gets to see this pattern. We're the special group of people who are supporting this designer and helping them with their patterns, and we're a special little club. And that's, I think, it's just human nature. those are, I think, some of the benefits that take it from a more exploitative relationship to a more collaborative one. I will say, though, that you, as the potential test knitter, also want to do your due diligence. You want to vet any designer that you're considering working with. So you want to be aware of designers who have unreasonable expectations. Check the deadlines for test knits. Make sure, that you are getting an adequate amount of time. Is it reasonable to knit one sock in 4 weeks? Yes. Is it reasonable to knit one sweater in 4 weeks? No, especially if you are knitting a larger size. Just not. It's just not. So make sure that your designer, that any designer that you're considering testing for, is being reasonable about what a um, rational timeline is for completing the project. Um, there are other considerations as well. Again, does your designer require you to use a specific yarn? That's a red flag.
Whoa, partner, little red flag going up.
Are there a lot of sort of onerous check-in requirements along the way? Like, do you have to check in daily? Things like that. Your time is still your own. And particularly given that you are not getting any kind of financial compensation, the amount of work that can be required of you in a specific period of time has to be reasonable. Pretty standard things you can expect is the designer is going to want you to work to gauge, because if you're not working to gauge, you're not really testing the pattern, because your thing is going to come out is not going to match the dimensions. Some designers, particularly if we are talking about just getting a lot of finished objects to showcase the pattern, some designers may not be as concerned about that. But it is a pretty typical and reasonable expectation that you're going to work at the same gauge, or at least pretty close. Designers will probably want to know how much yarn your thing used, because that's going to help them refine the yarn, the yardage or meterage estimates in the pattern. That's pretty normal. Sharing a photo, if you are required to share a photo on Ravelry and Instagram, and but just sending a photo of your finished object, that's pretty normal. Designers probably also want you to check before making any major modifications, because again, you're trying to test a pattern. If you're making major modifications, you're no longer testing the pattern. Again, this may, making modifications for your size is pretty standard. But if you were trying to turn a pullover into a cardigan, that's kind of a big one. So designers might not be thrilled about that. But those are sort of like the basic things. The other thing is, and this is a lot harder to tell, test knitting should not be being used as a substitute for tech editing. And it can be difficult to tell if the pattern designer is doing that. Now, that's not to say that the pattern is always going to be tech edited before it's test knit. Sometimes the timing just doesn't work out. Sometimes they happen at the same time. Different designers do it in different ways. The pattern being given to you should be as complete as possible. And while in an ideal world, it would go to the tech editor first, sometimes things just get kind of screwed up. So you may find more errors. But if the pattern you're going through and you find it's just kind of riddled with errors and typos and all kinds, that means you're not getting kind of the best version. By and large, when a pattern is ready to go to the tech editor, it should be pretty correct. Like, yes, there might be some stitch counts off, or but it's if it really seems like the pattern has just been sent out with no kind of review, because the designer should be doing a final review of the pattern. That can be a red flag, because test knitters are each doing one size, and they're not looking at the whole pattern as a whole. And that's something that a tech editor is it really needed to do. Um, so sometimes it can be hard to look out for, but just something to keep in mind. Even as you've already signed up, but even as you're working, so you know for the future, if you feel like um, the pattern hasn't been edited and the designer is relying on you, the test knitter, to find all of the problems so that they don't have to pay a tech editor, that is not good. One big element of the due diligence that you need to take up as the tester is to make sure you're not getting swept up in the hype around a pattern. If you would not pay money for this pattern, don't test knit it. Even if it's from a big designer and you've always wanted to test knit for so and so, and you finally got selected, do you actually like the thing? Because if you don't, do not test knit it. Ultimately, when the test knit is over, you're going to have this thing, and hopefully you're going to use it and love it. So some of my favorite sweaters are things that I have test knit. And I think that's really because I was so enamored of the project that, I was willing to take on the requirements of the test to work in a deadline and to work to gauge and not make major modifications and provide feedback. Those all do take time, even if you are actually enjoying the process of knitting. These are some additional demands on your time, but ultimately, I actively wanted to do those things because I liked whatever the thing was so much. If you don't like the thing, you're not going to like it more once you're done and have invested, more time than in a typical uh, project, because you're working within a set time frame and you got to stop and check and provide feedback and weigh your, all of the stuff. So don't. Make sure you like the thing enough that if you were not test knitting it, if you just saw it after it had been released, you would buy it. Otherwise, it's not worth it.
I'm not worth it?
So, bottom line, test knitting can be exploitative depending on the designer that's involved, but overwhelmingly, I think it can be a collaborative, enjoyable experience for everyone if you consider test knitting early, free access to a pattern you would knit anyway. Early, so you're special. You're the first adopter. Free, excellent. You would knit anyway. I really think this is key, and it gets lost sometimes. So, if you enjoy early free access to patterns from a designer, and this particular design is something you would knit even if you had to pay for it, definitely go for test knitting, assuming you check the expectations of the test knit and make sure that they work for you and your lifestyle. But if all of those elements aren't there, no, do not do it. Don't test knit. It's not worth it. All right, friends, there you have my hot take on test knitting. I am eager to hear what you think of test knitting, whether you agree or disagree, good, bad experiences you have had. Please do leave a comment and let me know. I really would enjoy hearing about other people's experiences. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it interesting, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and be sure you subscribe. New knitting videos here every Saturday. If you are looking for me on social media, you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as Media Peruana, and I will see you soon in another video.